They say love makes blind. Well, in politics, that's not the case, nor should it be. I love the EU, no doubt about that. I think that in these troubled times, European integration is the only sensible way forward for our continent. But that doesn't mean that we have to close our eyes when things go wrong. On the contrary, if you believe in Europe, if you love Europe, it's your duty to be the most vocal critic, especially when Europe falls short of its potential and of our expectations. And that's exactly what is happening right now with the vaccination in Europe. A fiasco, I called it, and a fiasco it is. Let's look to the facts. Well, after nearly 2 months, the rollout of vaccines is dramatically low in Europe. On average, not more than 4% of the European citizens received a first dose. And in most countries, the vaccination came nearly to a halt the last days. Well, this dramatic slow pace is in stark contrast with our production capacity of vaccines. Europe is no more, no less than the world leader in vaccine production today. Look, more than 75% of all vaccines worldwide are produced in Europe. And also, the majority of the nearly 200 million COVID vaccines that have already been produced are coming from European factories. Nevertheless, there is a crucial lack of supply in every European member state. A lack that we don't see in the same dramatic proportions in countries like, for example, the United States, in Britain, in Canada, or in Israel. On the contrary, in the United States, nearly 10% of the population received already a first dose. In Britain, it's 20%. In Israel, even more than half of the population. So the question is, what is going wrong? Well, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who is responsible for the European vaccination program, recognized that there are problems. A few days ago, in the European Parliament, she said the following.
Wir waren spät dran bei der Zulassung. Wir waren zu optimistisch bei der Massenproduktion. Und vielleicht waren wir uns auch zu sicher, dass das Bestellte tatsächlich pünktlich geliefert wird.
So, in summary, what she is saying is, we did nothing wrong, we were only a little bit too optimistic about our capacity to produce in Europe. But that's not what the facts are telling us, as we produce the vast majority of these vaccines. Apparently, what is happening is that we export them to other countries and that we keep only a tiny portion for ourselves. So the question remains, how did this happen? Well, in my opinion, the answer lies in the contracts Europe negotiated with the pharmaceutical companies, contracts that have been concluded last year. And I personally looked into 3 of these contracts. And while not all elements, especially on price and quantities, have been made public, it becomes immediately crystal clear when you read these contracts where the origin of our vaccination problems come from. These contracts are extremely unbalanced. They are precise on pricing and liabilities, but they are extremely weak and vague on supply and on timing. And more precise, there appears 4 big problems in these contracts, 4 problems that are at the same time 4 escape routes to the contractual obligations of the pharmaceutical companies involved. The first and most important problem one is the fact that all 3 contracts are based from the side of the pharmaceutical industry not on binding commitments, but on what is called best reasonable efforts. A very vague notion that is ill-defined in the first part of these contracts and that has already been invoked by the CEO of one of the pharmaceutical companies to explain the backlog in its deliveries. The second problem is that most of the timelines, delivery calendars and volumes in the contracts are approximate or indicative and never mandatory or binding. And the third problem, apparently in contrast to the contracts concluded by the United Kingdom, is the absence of a clause authorizing the export of these vaccines outside the European Union, and this only after the fulfillment of the commitments in volume foreseen in the contract. And then finally, there is the clear loss of time and precious weeks by not using, for reasons of liabilities toward third parties, of fast-track procedures by the European Medicine Agency in the approval of these vaccines. The cumulative effect of these provisions, or the absence of it, is really devastating. Only the amount of doses that, based on the contractual obligations of the companies, is not subject to be exported to countries like, for example, the UK, US, Israel, Canada, Japan or others, is today available for the vaccination of the citizens in the member states of the European Union. Prolonging by doing so, in my opinion, dramatically the COVID pandemic on the European continent. And the measures, meanwhile, taken by the European Commission are, I think, newly symbolic, insufficient, and to some extent even counterproductive. The use, for example, of Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol has been a diplomatic disaster, destroying in a few seconds the seriousness of the negotiations with the United Kingdom conducted by Michel Barnier for more than 3 years. The introduction of a new export authorization for COVID vaccines adds, I think, only unnecessary burden to the process, and by doing so prolongs and certainly doesn't speed up the vaccination of our European citizens. And the appointment of Commissioner for Industry, Thierry Breton, to further extend the vaccine production capacity in Europe is certainly a sensible move. But as already indicated, it is not so much the capacity in Europe that constitutes the problem, but the allocation of the produced doses. However, I think an extension of the production capacity can always help to soften that problem. But ultimately, what is needed, I think, is a radical change in our strategy. In the short term, we need to use the power of the European Union to renegotiate the ill-conceived contracts with the pharmaceutical industry. Binding commitments and mandatory timelines and volumes must replace the indicative goals that are foreseen today. Export clauses, as apparently the UK has in its contracts, respecting these commitments and timelines, need to be introduced. And for the upcoming authorizations of vaccines from, for example, Johnson & Johnson and CureVac, I think that the European Medicines Agency must follow a fast-track procedure, putting aside the question of liabilities towards third parties, because in the case of a pandemic, liabilities is more a theoretical concept, I think, than a real threat. And in the longer term, a real health union must be established with a real budget so that we can match the United States in supporting the development and production of new medicines and treatments by the pharmaceutical industry. And part of this union must also, I think, be an agency specialized and responsible for the European-wide acquisition of medicines to avoid the errors made during this pandemic. And finally, also the question of patent rights need to be openly discussed and addressed. Well, one lesson to be taken from this fiasco is already crystal clear for me. As often, the European Union is not a problem, but a solid basis for the solution.